One of the big movers in the abolition movement up in Oberlin was Charles Gradiston Finney. And now he was originally a professor at Oberlin College, but he became the second president eventually. But this guy was a fiery preacher. He had tent revivals. He was part of the Second Great Awakening, which said basically you could be saved as many times as you repented. So they were kind of getting beyond the idea of the fire and brimstone, you're going to hell. And so this whole area, this was founded on the idea that everybody was equal and that, like I said, slavery was against the will of God. From the beginning in Oberlin, they allowed blacks and women into the college. And so by the time Finney became president of Oberlin in the early 1850s, he'd already had 20 years of equality in this town. So you had blacks and women who were doctors and professors, and they were fully integrated into the society because it was a society built on equality. And so, next slide. And so what you had by the 1850s in Oberlin, the Fugitive Slave Act had passed in 1850. So that was the act that said that slave owners from Kentucky could come into Ohio and they could capture fugitive slaves and take them back to slavery. So in Oberlin, you had fugitive slave handbills telling people that we think there's a slave hunter around, be careful and stay hidden. At the same time, there were handbills being passed out in Ohio and in Oberlin saying $150 reward for slaves. And so what they were doing was that, they were trying to hide the slaves, and they were trying to do whatever they could to help them get through Ohio and across Lake Erie. They knew of shipping lines and different places where you could actually take somebody out. Lake Erie is actually very shallow, and you can actually walk out into it for quite a ways in certain parts of it. So they would walk out to waiting boats or take a little rowboat out there, and there were islands in Lake Erie that are actually Canadian islands. And so once they got to Oberlin, they were almost there, So in Oberlin, everybody took part in what was going on, and the women were a big part of it. And again, these women had equality since, for 20 years or so. And so, next slide, sorry. So what the women did was on your left, you'll see the quilt block called the Ohio Star. And what they came up with was a quilt block called the Oberlin Star, which is over on the right. And they added the quilt block called the Wanderer. And so they had these quilt blocks in their windows. And if you saw this and you were a fugitive slave, you would know that you were on your route. You were following the North Star. You're on your route to Lake Erie, and that this was a safe house because this house had the Oberlin Star with the Wanderer in it. And so they were there to help them. And so things went along with the Oberlinites, fighting against slavery, for 20 years or so. And they were on the radar of President Buchanan. And President Buchanan was a pro-slavery Democrat. And this is back in the days when the Democrats were the conservatives and the Republicans were the party of Lincoln, okay? And so everything came to a head on September 13th, 1858. And this is when a U.S. Marshal and some slave owners from Kentucky came up into Oberlin looking for the slave named John Price. And this is supposed to be next slide, sorry. This is supposed to be a depiction of the capture of John Price. And so John Price was a fugitive slave, and he was living in Oberlin as a free man. He was working as a handyman. He had been there for a few years, and he was actually one of the recipients of the little Oberlin welfare. So they were giving him like $1.25 or $1.50 a week to help out. But anyway, so he was part of the community, And so the U.S. Marshal and the slave owner tricked John Price. They captured him. They put him in the back of a bunk board, and they took him. They were going to take him down to Columbus and across the Ohio River back to slavery. And so you can see Oberlin's right there in the middle with the blue circle, and then Wellington is just south of it. So they were on their way with John Price down to Wellington, and then from there they were going to go south the next day. And along Route 58, as they were driving south in their buckboard, going north on Route 58 was Ansel Lyman, my great uncle, with one of his buddies, and they were in their buggy. And as they passed the U.S. Marshal and John Price, they heard John Price screaming, and he was covered up. They couldn't really see him, but they could hear that something was going on, right? And his buddy, Ansel Lyman's buddy, says after they passed, they didn't challenge them because they were college students, you know. Ansel Lyman was an English major even, you know. If you listen to Garrison Keillor talk about English majors, you know, they do things, you know. So anyway, they passed him, and as they passed him, the buddy says, let's not get involved. This is just some black guy. Let's not get involved. We're not gonna tell people back in Oberlin what we saw, right? So they get back to Oberlin, and the marshal heads south, you know, with John Price, and they get back to Oberlin, and Ansel Lyman decides that he's going to tell everybody in town, right? And so he tells everybody, and they're all pissed off because they all knew John Price. It's a little town. He was there. He was an upstanding citizen. He was a handyman. So the next day, from the historical accounts, they pretty much took every horse and buggy and buckboard and clubs and maybe a few guns, and they went down. So you have one little town in Ohio, you know, tearing down the dirt road, which is now Route 58, down to Wellington to save John Price. Okay, so next slide. So they end up in Wellington, and the marshal has got John Price in the Wadsworth Hotel, which is on your left here, and the Oberlinites tried to negotiate initially. They tried to use legal maneuvers, and some of these are going to sound familiar in a way, because what they were saying, their two legal arguments were, one was the Fugitive Slave Act was unconstitutional because it was against the Constitution of the state of Ohio. Now, what does that sound like? That sounds like Prop 122 that Arizona passed last year. We're not going to do this because it's unconstitutional. So that's what the Oberlinites were saying. This is unconstitutional because this is a free state. The other thing that they were saying was that it's like SB 1062. It's against my religion bill. They were saying that slavery was against the will of God, against their religion, so they didn't have to abide by slavery or the Fugitive Slave Act. So they tried those legal maneuvers, but they didn't get anywhere. So a few of the Oberlinites stormed into the hotel. They found John Price tied up in the attic. They tossed him out the window to a waiting buckboard, right? And they took him back to Oberlin. So they recaptured the poor guy. And so when they got him up to Oberlin, they put him in the Fairchild house over there on the right. And Fairchild was a professor at Oberlin, but he wasn't really a known safe house. And so they thought he'd be safe there, and they stuck him there. He stayed there for a few days. He escaped to Canada, never to be heard from again. So he got out. We don't know what happened to the guy, but he was freed, and he got away from the Kentuckians. So he was never to be heard from again, but who was the Oberlin rescuers. And so Buchanan didn't want to let Ohio get away with this because, you know, they were defying the laws of the country. And so a grand jury indicted 37 of the Oberlinites, some black men and some white men. And here they are in front of the jail in Cleveland. And so they said they were violating the Fugitive Slave Act because they took that slave back from the U.S. Marshal and the rightful owner, the Kentuckian. And so, but the Ohioans, they decided that two could play at this game. So they arrested the marshal and the Kentuckians because they said that they were violating the laws of Ohio, and they kidnapped a free man who was John Price. And so you had like a stalemate because you had the rescuers in jail in Cleveland, and you had the marshal in jail probably in Lorain County or in Oberlin someplace. And so they made a plea deal, basically. They let a lot of the rescuers go if they wanted to, and they only tried two guys, Simeon Bushnell and Charles Langston. And so one's a black guy and one's a white guy. And so this whole trial of the Oberlin rescuers went like worldwide, because one thing the rescuers were really good at was public relations. They started a newspaper called The Rescuer, which they published from jail, and I'm not sure exactly how they did that. They probably sent it back to Granston Finney in Oberlin and had it typed up and circulated. But basically, everybody on the East Coast, all the abolitionists in New York City and Boston and Washington, D.C., they were watching what was going on in Ohio because Ohio was testing those laws. It was testing the slavery laws, and it was testing the Fugitive Slave Act. And so it really fanned the flames of abolition. And in hindsight, you know, Buchanan might have thought, well, maybe if I just kept quiet, it would have been better for me, because basically it sparked lots of debate in the country about, you know, slavery and why we should have slavery or whether or not we should get rid of it. So anyway, the rescuers were in jail from December through the following June, and the whole time, like I said, the speeches were going on, the newspaper articles, and so basically, not long after they were released in June 1859, the Civil War eventually started. And so that's why they call Oberlin the town that started the Civil War. And so, like I said, the Bushnell and Langston got light sentences. I think Buchanan was hoping they would just go away. But like I said, it became known as the town that started the Civil War. But one thing that's really, next slide. One thing that's really sort of ironic and also kind of sad and frustrating in a way is that so many of these issues are still struggles today. What about economic and social justice? What about exploitation of workers? What about the wage slavery or just plain slavery? Those things are still going on today. We're still fighting these same struggles that the Oberlin rescuers were fighting against. We're fighting against the idea of what's constitutional or not, and whether your religion trumps the law. And so, I think that what we need to do is think about the story of the Oberlin rescuers and think about Ansel Lyman. The next time that you're challenged to do something for social justice, are you going to keep quiet like Ansel's pal, or are you going to go back and tell everybody? That's it.